Welcome to ASD Shine Bright, the podcast. My name is Corey Young, as part of Team ASD. We're here at Wendler Middle School, home of the Rams. I'm joined by an awesome principal, Marcus Wilson, and we're here celebrating Black History Month. And also, he's somebody I've known before I've worked in the district. He's a longtime educator, actually from here in Anchorage, went to school, and we're going to just talk about his journey as an educator. So thank you for joining me, Principal Wilson. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Corey.
Awesome. So let's just get right into it. Tell me, you grew up here. Were you born and raised here? Tell me a little bit about, tell us a little bit about your background here in Anchorage.
Yeah, I was born and raised, the only one out of all of my brothers. I have 5 other brothers, but I was the only one because I'm the youngest that was born and raised here in Anchorage. Originally spent my early childhood in Fairview. In the Fairview neighborhood, and then when I would say about 7 or 8, we moved just right across the street over here to College Village, where I spent the rest of my younger years.
Awesome. So you went to Fairview Elementary?
I didn't. For kindergarten, I went to Tom Thumb Montessori School.
Oh, okay.
And then I went to Rogers Park because we moved to College Village at that time. But all of my brothers went to Fairview Elementary.
So Rogers Park, then Wendler, which you're now the principal of, which is awesome. And then you went to, I'm assuming, East High, now Betty Davis.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Tell me a little bit about your experiences as a student. What were some things that inspired you? Was it certain teachers? Was it certain subjects?
If I go back to my elementary days, I was a student that struggled. And I struggled with a lot of things back in my early years. I would say somebody who really helped me and is always near and dear to my heart, retired ASD teacher. And I always just say she is my absolute favorite teacher, and that was Barbara Bankston. She was my 2nd grade teacher over at Rogers Park. She was hard on me, but I knew where that was coming from, and she did it with compassion and love. But some things I even still struggle with that she helped me out with was just organization, being responsible, being accountable, some of those things. So I'm always just grateful to her. And something that I love is she had a connection to my parents. She knew my parents outside of school. So it was just one of those things, don't let nothing get back to your parents is the era I grew up in. But, she never had to get to that point. It always stayed at school, and that's something that I appreciate it with. And I always kind of take to heart because I know a lot of people around town, a lot of their kids go to school here with me. So I give them and provide the same thing to them as well. Even though I'm here and I know your parents really well, doesn't mean I'm going to get on the phone right away and call your parents and let them know about everything that's, going on here at school. So I just, I look back on some of those life lessons. But another thing that I would say too is kind of getting to my journey of why I even moved into education is, I had an elementary teacher, and I had that particular person for 2 years, and I just really felt like, that teacher kind of targeted me, and just really wasn't there to just really help me versus just, trying to find my faults and tell my parents about things that I'm not doing and things like that. And I'll just kind of leave it like that without getting into specifics, but it was really tough. Something I would say too is, that person really kind of drove a wedge between other students at school. And what I'm saying, it kind of drove a racial wedge between, I would say other African-American students that were at that school and other Caucasian students that were at the school. Something that teacher would do is come in and read like a racial joke books, after recess. Some of that stuff just really sticks to me, to this day. I come from an era where, things like that hurt. But we were just taught, to listen, to respect the adults. So I never did go back and tell my parents what was going on versus just kind of endured stuff like that and, probably just held on to it. And that's kind of what brought me into education is, I just really wanted to go back and help kids that really felt, like they didn't have hope and things like that, or they really felt lost, or they really felt like, in my case, like I didn't belong. So that's why I even came back. I graduated college. I was going to go a whole different route. I graduated from Eastern Washington University with a Bachelor's of Science degree in human biology and wanted to go into medicine. But I came back, and my wife and I went to college over at the University of Laverne, which was a satellite school here in Anchorage. And, she was getting her master's degree in business. So along the journey, I said, I'll hop in and do that with you. But while I was doing that, I told her I wanted to go back and be a substitute teacher because that was my way of kind of going back without officially becoming a teacher or anything, to just talk with kids, interact with kids, and seeing, how different things were from when I was in school. Just seeing, behavioral issues, just, it was almost an epidemic to me, seeing what was going on in school and just seeing, just a lack of male presence in school. It just pulled me in. So I started, I applied after, I was a substitute teacher for about 2.5 years until I finished my master's degree. And then I applied with the Anchorage School District to be a Title I tutor. I did that for 1.5 years, and I started over in your old stopping grounds over in Clark Middle School. Oh, yeah. And oh yeah, and I loved it. Yeah, I loved working with kids, and it just kind of drew me in even more. And then I would say the most impactful job that I had was the job I moved into after that, and that was a family school service coordinator. I was a half-time family school service coordinator over at Ursa Minor and between Denali Elementary School, and did that job for over 5 years. But that was an impactful job because it really took me outside of the school to see the lives some of the kids were living, and just kind of teaching me the impact that I have, probably some of the naivety I had in myself, like, not everybody lived the life I had with 2 parents and things like that. And, just seeing some of the situations, some of these kids were in and dealing with before they even came to school. So that's kind of the whole journey that brought me to, I would say, to where I am now in education.
Love it. So after you said Denali and Ursa, it was major?
I did a split time between Denali and major, so I was half-time at each school.
What was your next step after that?
My next step after that was I was an elementary teacher. I went back to school and got my post-baccalaureate degree in education and teaching. And I started out for about 1 year teaching over at Denali Elementary, and then I went and taught over at my neighborhood where I lived at that time was Fairview Elementary. Yeah, I went back home.
What grades did you teach?
4th grade. Yeah, 4th grade teacher over at Fairview.
I'm sure the stories are good. What were some of the things you did there in that experience as a teacher? That instilled what you talked about, some of the things that you didn't get, not having a teacher that was creating wedges, a teacher that was creating more positives. I can tell you experiences I've had with teachers, good and bad, where it does shape how you think of things and subjects you do and how you believe in yourself.
I think I can really relate to the kids. A lot of them I walked to school. with them from my house. They all knew where I lived, and knock on wood, nobody ever did anything, to my home. But, just showing them that, it doesn't matter where you start. I knew some of them were in tough situations and things like that, but, no excuses. There's not going to be these rosy hands coming out to grab you and coddle you, especially as you get older and things like that. But just, being that kind of person that I felt that I know I had, not necessarily inside of school besides somebody like Miss Bankston, but I was blessed growing up. I had a lot of my parents' friends. I was just a type of hustler around the neighborhood where I cut a lot of yards and did a lot of odd jobs for people in the neighborhood. And one thing I tell kids is I always just listen to the adults. I listened to, the elders out in the community and sat down and just listened to their stories and all the advice that they would give me. And that's something that I encourage more of the young people to do now is, absorb some of that information and the stories and history and things like that, which I feel is going to, one, help you in life, but make you value, some of the things that we currently have now that were quite a struggle, for people like in my parents' era and before them, I just remember some of the conversations with my dad about how education was back when he was growing up, back to how it is now, and it just really made me appreciate, what we had. Now, I'm not going to portray myself as a perfect kid by any means, but something I tell the kids, I did a lot of knucklehead stuff, that I have to admit to now. But the one thing I didn't do, I did not disrespect my elders, teachers and things like that. I just, we were always taught that respect, and that's something that, still sits with me to today.
That's good. I do. My parents probably around the same age, or at least close to the age. My mom is 71, but she's told me stories of my grandfather was in the military, and she remembers still having colored water fountains and white water fountains. That was my mom, and so it's really not that far removed of what education was in her experiences. And it obviously is different, so I did appreciate that as well. Getting an education that was different, that was, put me in a position to be more successful. Let's talk about, so when did you decide to be a principal and why?
Can I go back to that,
Of course, yeah.
back to that question? I would say, I feel blessed for living and growing up here in Anchorage for some of those things that that you just said. My parents went through segregation, and they never really talked a lot about those stories or shared a lot of those stories. I saw a lot of that come out as my dad got older and, started kind of losing that capacity to hold things in. So he just started sharing, and I just kind of heard some of those things come out that I've never heard come out of his mouth before, but I know he was just holding a lot of that in. But that's something I always appreciated growing up here in Anchorage, which, I'm a fight to keep in our community is, we weren't taught, to hate, people of other cultures and things like that. And that's something I always appreciated here growing up in Anchorage. I look at my friend base, and when I go to the lower 48s and things like that, and that's how you age yourself as being from Alaska, using that word. But, people didn't have a lot of the opportunities that we had of just, growing up around so many different cultures and not having that pressure, of staying in this group or staying in this group. And, that's something I just love about living in this and growing in this community here.
I would agree. So tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming a principal. What was your first school and why did you want to become one?
Oh, man. My first school, and I love that school to death. I love the families, but it was North Star Elementary. I was a principal there, and it was like the Wild Wild West. I mean, there was a lot that was going on, but it really grew me up and grew me into the person I am, today. And that's, fight for what's right for kids, something I always remember, and I love her to death, our old superintendent, Carol Como. And I always remember her mantra was, when you're making decisions, always make decisions that it's good for kids. And that's something that always goes through my head when I'm making decisions. Not to say, I don't think about staff or parents or the impact that's going to have, but that North Star I have to keep too, especially when you're making hard decisions is always, do what's right for kids. But I also got to take care of staff and the parents and community. So
done a good job of that. One of the reasons why I want to talk to you, in my former career, I was a TV news reporter, and I covered a story once of you at North Star, and it was like a male mentorship program, and I was super impressed by it. There's mentorship programs across the country and the world. I've been part of those myself as a kid. But what you inspired those young people, no matter what they look like, no matter, it was all males, and they had to dress a certain way, they had to act a certain way, and to me, it was just setting a standard of how to approach this world and how to be successful no matter what you choose.
Yeah, and I would say I miss my boys, and I have to say young ladies too, because it started out to be a boys group, but eventually some young ladies that had brothers as a part of the group and things like that, and part of the elementary basketball team that I used to coach, they all just kind of started to be a part of that. And it was really impactful. And I say that because I still see some of the young men and still young ladies out in the community, and as adults now, doing their thing, just coming up telling me, just thank you and how that impacted their life and how much fun. And I thank the parents. I honestly do. I thank the parents, because something we don't have in our community as much as we had before, and that's for various reasons, is trust. And the parents really entrusted me with their kids, because I would have them in school sometimes. On a Saturday, I would open up the school, open up the gym, feed them, give them some time in the lab and things like that. But just, spending that quality time with the kids and instilling that in them. And something that I loved is when we had that group over at North Star, I would also track them to middle school, and as much as I could try to track them into high school. But we had some great business partners, the Anchorage International Rotary, Great Harvest Bread with Dirk and his wife Barbara. When they owned it, I mean, they closed that place down one time, well, at least half of it. But I brought like 60 kids up in that business, and we made bread, we made cookies, and I mean, he walked them through the whole process. But part of that process was, I remember in my childhood, we would go and spend time with our elders, like in the Pioneer Home and different elderly facilities around here, and have conversations with adults, because a lot of them didn't have that family that consistently came in to see them. And going back to my earlier conversation of just the power of listening to our elders and respecting that. So I took all of those kids along with the bread and cookies that they made, and we just did some stops, and we went and picked up our middle school students, that used to be a part of our group. And we went out in the community, and, I taught the students how to have those conversations. Like, how do you even open up and have a conversation with somebody you don't know? And we just did some practicing, because some of them were like, how old are you? And I was like, man, you got to watch, especially asking our older ladies about, how old they are. So I said, I said, growing up here in Anchorage, I said the beauty of, especially with the folks that are at this age, either way, a lot of people have come from so many different places up here. So just the value of asking them where they're from, you know, and what the varied answer you're going to get could just be a great starter. You know, when we first did it, I could just remember, you know, going there and the kids were all like, on the way, oh man, we don't really want to do this. But the thing that always touched my heart is when it came for us to shut it down and leave, they begged me to stay because they were having so much fun just, you know, just talking. So just, you know, the power of just, you know, teaching the next generation, those kind of things. So those kind of things that could be, you know, passed down, which is, you know, truly some of those things that, you know, makes Anchorage and just our community special.
You're saying those are words that touch my heart because I 100% agree. Talking about like now at Wendler, you've been here at Wendler for how long?
Year number 7.
Oh, wow. That's very strong. At your old school. What, you know, you can talk a little bit about some of the stuff you've done here at Wendler, but, you know, one of my last questions I want to ask you is like, what are some of the things you hope to inspire? You talked a lot about, I'll let the bell ring as I'm talking, with students, but also with future educators or those that are out there watching, specifically, and I'm just going to say it, as an African-American principal, longtime educator.
What are some of those?
Yeah, things that you're trying to inspire out of people. I've heard multiple people throughout the district that speak very highly of you and your mentorship, you know, obviously with students, but with themselves in their professional careers. They're not even teachers or principals. I mean, some might be aspiring to, but some are outside the community. So what are some of the things that you know, if somebody out here is watching this, to be inspired to, you know, represent and to be able to be that person for students or whatever career they're choosing?
You know, honestly, Corey, I just, you know, I try a combination of things. I try to be the person that I felt that I needed when I was a child in school. You know, something that kids will probably talk to you about if they talk about me is the conversations. I always just try to have real conversations with kids, and I had a lot of real conversations, but they didn't come in school. You know, they came outside of school with my dad's friends and people in the church community. And, you know, Anchorage was, I think, just a little tighter community back then, you know, when we were growing up. So somebody will drop a nugget on you real fast and correct you real fast, you know, because we were just that kind of community back then. Anybody's parent could correct you. And I appreciated that, and I needed that. And it's helped me to be the person that I am now. The other thing, you know, I really try to kids, and something I really I learned from my parents and, you know, just people around me and my fraternity members is that community service piece, is that piece of giving back. When there's a need, being that person that just doesn't talk about what I'm gonna do, but actually doing it. That's something that's, you know, in me to my core. Just always being involved in the community, always doing things to help kids and others. That's it. You know, I just value education. You know, one story I heard about my dad, and like I said, just growing up, my dad didn't share a lot about his childhood with us, but just hearing from another friend that worked in the school district, I had to smile and laugh like I knew the story, but I didn't. He said his dad grew up with my dad, and he said my dad was 14 years old, you know, living in Monroe, Louisiana, and he drove the bus to get kids to school, you know, and I'm just like, man, you know, the kids here just have to know just how good they have it, not to be the person that just has to wake up as a 14-year-old to drive all the kids in that community to and from school, but those are the lessons and things like that we just, have to teach and keep handing down to kids. So, I kind of get bent out of shape sometimes, when you just don't see just that value of how important education is, how important being here at school is, coming to school that wasn't even an option growing up. It just blows me away, so I know I have to adjust to the new times, but then there's parts of me that are old school, like, hey, there's going to be no adjustment for you, going into the workspace and not being at work every day. Just, keep grinding some of those same lessons into our kids that were grinded into us. I'm old school on one hand, I'm a really big hand, but, I can adjust. Hearing the words like the homie fade, which we would probably call slap boxing in our days and stuff like that. I just laugh when I have to age myself or when I deal with situations with kids sometimes.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. As the bell continues to ring, you may have heard some sounds of our wonderful middle school students. That's the sounds I hear no matter where we're at in this district, to be honest. But you gave us some really good insight and nuggets. If you're not inspired by this, then I'm not sure what else will get you inspired. So I really appreciate you, Principal Wilson. Thank you for being on ASD Shine Bright, the podcast.
No, I appreciate the conversation and the time, Corey, and what you do. Thank you.
So thank you guys for watching ASD Shine Bright, the podcast. Make sure you watch us wherever we're at. We're on all the social media for ASD, but also on Spotify and Apple Music. Amazon Music, we're all over the place. Just look for us. We'll see you until next time.